Thank you everyone for coming up. This is amazing, very cozy space here. I'm going to talk about dressing up game characters through my own examples, like through the productions I've worked on as a costume designer. So first, I'm going to introduce myself and talk a little bit about the differences between the fashion, costume and character. And after that, I'm going to present three productions with costume work that I've done. And at the end of each example, I'll address some challenges we had and what worked in the costume work and collaboration. So hi, I'm Heli. I'm a digital costume designer and a researcher at the Victoria University of Wellington. I originally flew to New Zealand from Finland for NZGDC 2019. And I was supposed to stay for 3 months, but I actually never left. I got a permanent job, and now I'm educating the next generation of digital fashion and costume designers as a lecturer in fashion design technology at Victoria. Ever since I worked on my first game project, I've been on a mission to bring together the professionals of fashion, costume, and games. So I tend to define the difference between costume and fashion at the beginning of my presentation, since they are confused quite a lot. So first of all, fashion subject is always customer or individual, whereas costume subject is always a character. Fashion serves the narrative of the individual. The individual can use tools of fashion to express a personal changing narrative through appearance. And costume is designed for a character which itself is without agenda. The costume is serving the narrative of a specific context. Fashion is confined by trends, whereas the costume has more spectrum and is not confined by trends. And lastly, fashion is always viewed in the contemporary context of the present reality, whereas costume is viewed in fictional contexts. So costume design is character and context specific and concentrate on the narrative features of clothing. It includes not only what the character is wearing and why, but also how the garment is worn and how the character's previous actions, events in the story or passing time have affected the condition of the clothing. Costume designers also define the entire appearance of the character, such as shoes, headwear, even physical characteristics such as scars and tattoos, whereas fashion designers always concentrate only on the clothing. And the description of costume design applies directly to game character design. The main difference in designing the costumes for games or live arts is that the costume design is mostly connected to the physical human body and tend to be an analog art form. In live arts, the restrictions of costume design are connected to the reality and physical laws, while costume in games is restricted by the technology. To provide some historical context to costume work on games, I'll introduce a few examples of productions that consulted costume and fashion designers. The first example that I know of was Wendy Cork designing and sourcing the costumes for 3D scan for LA Noire. Lim Paolo followed similar workflow for sourcing the costumes for GTA 5. And my third example is actually not a costume designer, but a fashion designer. Errolson Hugh from Fashion Studio Acronym helped to define the jacket of the protagonist of Deus Ex Mankind Divided. And then there was me working on Control for 2 years, from 2016 to 2018. I designed all their main costumes for the main characters. There are some more costume designers working on games currently that I know of, but I can't share their projects yet, maybe later. I'll introduce 2 versions of the costume pipeline we utilized during the production of Control, an analog and digital one. And I'll be revisiting some material from my 2019 NZGDC talk, since the more recent costume work I'm introducing today is based on the pipeline that we utilized in Control. So before presenting the costume pipelines, I'll introduce the game briefly to provide context to the costume work I did. So Control is a supernatural action adventure game that takes place in the oldest house, which is the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Control. The protagonist, Jessie Faden, uncovers the answers she seeks as she grows into the role of the director of the Bureau. And the environment is an ever-shifting supernatural location that exists outside of the laws of reality. So when I started working at Remedy, I had no idea how games are made and how game characters come to be. So my first task was to talk to everyone involved with the characters around the studio, and I compiled that information into these pipelines. The stages of character development are categorized on the left, and on the right are the professionals responsible for those specific sections. So now on the left we have Remedy's character pipeline before Control, and on the right the pipeline we utilized for the 2 years I worked for them. And I have emphasized the differences in red. I ended up integrating methods from live arts into the original character pipeline, and I'll be defining some of these sections during the next slides. And for comparison, here are the sections where Cork, Powell and Eroson were involved. Reading about Cork's and Powell's work on games, it seemed that the technological requirements of game production often exceed basic costume designer skills, and the lack of tools and vocabulary may have prevented further collaboration. So I'm sharing my work with Remedy to develop the communication between costume and game designers and to present options for longer-term involvement and collaborations. So I won't be introducing every section of the pipeline. That would take the whole presentation. But I'll concentrate on specific ones that relate to the costume work in my later examples. The first section I introduce is the dress code, which refers to a design document that frames the style of the NPCs in the game and reflects to the costumes of the main characters in comparison. These are some of my NPC concepts, but we have multiple people designing these NPCs, and this dress code framework maintained the style consistent across the production. The NPCs of Control are mostly people who work in FBC, regular bureau staff such as office workers, maintenance and security, and I kept their style classic, timeless and generic to contrast to the unpredictable supernatural environment. So most of Control's costumes are based on the fundamentals of traditional office wear such as straight pants and dress shirts. So next we'll have a more linear look at the pipeline through the development of the protagonist, Jessie Faden. And this one followed, Jessie's pipeline was an analog one. So first I'd like to address the biggest difference in the costume process of stage and games. For stage, I always had a full script to start from, but for Control's characters, I sometimes only had 2 or 3 sentences to work from. And I found it really hard to analyze the personality of the character based on this little information. And I attempted to grasp all character information provided by the writers with this Lyos-Egg response structure of a 3-dimensional character. So after the character analysis, I conducted research on the themes and context of the game and gathered reference material, which I compiled into a mood board. The main idea was to communicate our protagonist Jessie's externality to bureau through style and materials. As framed in dress code, bureau clothes are made of durable and high-quality materials, and their style is old-fashioned and well-fitted, whereas Jessie wears contemporary street clothes and her materials are denim and jersey. And when Jessie arrives bureau, she rebels against the dress code, but she eventually grows into the role of the new director of the FBC, and this is expressed through her appearance. So doing pre-production of Control, I made around 130 concepts for Jessie. But after defining the final concept, I sourced actual physical wardrobe for her, since I knew that the actor Courtney Hope will come over and I will have a chance to fit these on her. And when she did, we had some outfit tests on her and defined the final look through this testing. And after that, we conducted a character photo shoot with Courtney to physicalize the character. She provided us material on how Jessie moves, her gestures and facial experience, and everything was recorded as reference material for the character team. And we had these character photo shoots for every main character of Control. Utilizing an actor for the character exploration helped us to define the idea of the appearance and the personality of the character. What we got from the photo shoots were the photo, motion and character references of the actual character in the costume, which were further utilized by concept artists, character technical artists, and for internal communication. So I designed and sourced or manufactured all the game's main costumes. The costumes helped actors internalize in the character and were later photo scanned. And this method utilized my specialty in character creation through the actor interaction and physical costumes. So after the photo shoot and defining the final outfit, I manufactured Jess's jacket. So I started with dyeing test. I wanted the jacket to be a very specific blue, so I spent 3 days doing dyeing test to find my blue. And after that, I hand dyed 5 pelts of deer leather and sent them off to a seamstress who manufactured the jacket according to Courtney Ho's measurements. And after that, I had to break it down and distress and mold it to make it look more worn. And after that, the jacket was scanned, 3D scanned. In addition, it was used for key art photo shoots and also for motion reference for character technical artists. And that was the last section of the analog version of the costume pipeline. The digital costume started with a similar workflow from mood board to the character iteration and define a final concept. But then in addition to the concept, I compiled a costume detail board, which provides the character artist all the costume-related information they need to deliver the costume accurately, such as materials, attachments, and the outfit layers. Oops, that went too far. And then I created the costume in Marvelous Designer. And the software is perfect for design communications since it is based on actual cloth manufacturer that I'm familiar with. So basically you import your character and then I manipulate the patterns on the 2D window and then I sew them digitally on the avatar and export an FBX. So to support character artists' work, I produce either live clothing for photoscan or digital clothing in Marvelous Designer, and that's the main difference between the analog and the digital pipelines. So what worked with the costume work with Control? Being a full-time in-house costume designer for 2 years allowed involvement throughout the character pipeline and improved the consistency and realism level of the costumes. Dress code further improved consistency, framing the NPC and character styles within the context of the game for the whole team. The character photoshoots with actors utilized the character building skills of the actors to bring nuances into the characters. And the costume definitions as detail boards supported character artists' work and saved them time from trying to figure out the costume construction, layering, details and materials themselves. And then I was sharing the room with the character artists, so I was always available for any quick reference requests, which were quite frequent. And Tom, can you scroll my notes? Thank you. So I provided costume support for the character team in various references: physical costumes, motion reference, texture shoots, costume detail boards, etc. And I would like to add that the Liosec response structure that I utilized for the script analysis should be added in this list, but it actually didn't work. There were too many changes to the characters to keep the bone structure updated, so I just adapted to working with the constantly modified character information. I was also available for live action studio work. For example, we shot some live action footage to be displayed in-game. The first image here is from the studio. I'm fixing the costume on Matthew Porretta, who played Dr. Darling. And on the second photo, you can see the material in-game. So it was very convenient to have an in-house costume designer who's used for these film studio workspaces. So what challenges we had? The first one is my personal challenge, just to learn to work with less character cues. And the second one, the communication within a large team and a complex production sometimes caused issues, for example, when the changes in narrative reached the character team with delay. And this is not exactly a challenge, it's just something that sometimes happens. So after spending 3 times defining my specific blue, the outcome is actually grey, and that's because my blue didn't work with the lighting of the game. So my next game example is Project X. I'm not allowed to talk about it really in detail or any of the content. but I'm allowed to talk about the process we had. So I worked for them as a costume designer at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. It's a cloud-native AAA MMO sandbox game, and they have no narrative, just the context. And with an international team. So basically most of the team is in Iceland and Finland, and then there's one of us in Australia and me in New Zealand. So to track the differences and similarities of costume work in these two productions, so Control and Project X, I'm aligning the pipelines utilized in both. Firstly, instead of character description or narrative, in Project X I was provided with just a context, such as the world, environment, climate, social hierarchies, regional differences, and timeline. The dress code framework was especially significant for this world, since there are multiple designers working on the characters and no narrative or character descriptions. So the dress code is basically defining the fashion of this world. And since I worked for them only part-time for a very short time, I took a shortcut and iterated the designs directly in Marvelous Designer instead of creating concept art. So I was again involved with the entire pipeline with one major difference when it comes to a team. Due to the different time zones, I couldn't attend all the character team meetings, and I remained a bit of an external member of the team. My tasks included further defining the world and the context and creating costume systems based on the themes of the game, gathering a reference library and compiling mood boards. I mainly worked on Marvelous Designer due to the iteration in the software and the actual costume manufacturer. We didn't have an analog pipeline with this production. And later in the production, I supported the character team with feedback and further reference material. So what worked? Mirror boards. We utilize this tool. It's an online whiteboard and a visual collaboration platform that allows us to visualize and develop our ideas on everything starting from game design to costume systems. And it was amazing, especially with challenging time zones, since the team could easily see what I've been up to while they were sleeping. And also we basically had all our meetings on the boards. So it was fantastic. Here are some mirror boards I developed for context work, costume systems, and regional dress codes. And they are purposefully zoomed too little to see, since I can't actually show you what they're about. But I promise 1 year I will talk about them. So secondly, I compiled costume packs for outsourcing. They included all the information needed to model and texture the costumes accurately. So the costume packs contained a Marvelous Designer file, an FBX of the fitted costume, and the patterns exported as flats to assist the UV layout. And instead of concept art, I included a render from Marvelous Designer into the detail board. The assets we didn't have costume packs for were visualized into a single reference or concept art for the outsourcing teams. And it was really common to give feedback at least 3 rounds per assets when we didn't have the costume packs for. So with costume packs, no additional feedback and corrections were required. So the packs significantly reduced the feedback loops. So what challenges did we have? The time zones. Usually the character meetings started at 10 p.m. in the evening. Also, we had a challenge with prioritizing the tasks. So most of my time went to defining specific costumes in Marvelous Designer and compiling the costume packs, while it would have been beneficial to allocate more time on the overview of the costumes. And due to multiple costume pack requests and an emphasis on the main costumes, I didn't have time to define all the smaller costume assets they needed within the short time frame. And when a deadline approached, the team ended up sending some quick references to the outsourcing, and this increased the feedback and iteration loops, and more money and time was spent on correcting the assets to fit the world and the context. Then we had a schedule conflict, since their most urgent need for costumes did not align with my time with them, but that just sometimes happens. It's really hard to predict beforehand. And their base mesh changed mid-production, so I had to refit all the costumes I had produced in Marvelous Designer until that point and update all the costume packs. And my third example is shadow work. I've been working on it as a character designer since the end of last year. It's a narrative-driven third-person action-adventure game that takes place in Wellington. And it's a story about a young woman, Swanhild, and her father, who are confronted by her doppelganger. When Swanhild's father embraces the copy and banishes her, she must battle supernatural forces and confront herself. So I'm aligning the pipeline utilized in Control with the pipeline we are following in Shadow Work to, again, point a couple of main differences. So firstly, the game director, Orator Echevarria, leads the team, but we make the decisions together. Everyone in the team are working on the context and narrative, and we discuss the gameplay mechanics and costumes together, but everyone's concentrating on what they know the best. And as in Project X, Marvelous Designer is utilized for design and technical iterations instead of just final costume manufacture. So we are working directly on Milanode, which is another online whiteboard and a visual collaboration platform. And here's the front page of our production with boards for gameplay systems, interactive narrative, story, world building, and presentation. And through the presentation board, we can access the character board, and through the character board, we can access the protagonist's board. So in Shadow Work, the costume functions as a narrative driver and has a role not only on expressing the context of the game and the personality of the protagonist, but also aligning with other gameplay features such as her abilities. The costume has a role in expressing Swanhild's emotional state, which is affected by player choices and the state of the world. Each reference category here signifies a certain character feature and explores how to visualize Swanhild's story, relationship to other characters, and emotions. Here are some of the initial concepts for Swanhild, but unfortunately I can't talk more about the significance of each costume detail without revealing the plot. And here we are currently. I've produced a Marvelous Designer file for her, and I compiled detail board on Milanode. At Remedy, the aesthetic requirements for design communication were really high, and adjustments to detail boards required returning to the original Photoshop file and resending it to the modeler. Compared to that, costume boards on Milanode are super quick and easy and adjustable. So what works? Communication. It's really great to be on the same time zone with the team. Also, it has been amazing to be able to contribute to the game mechanics and ability systems, which are not usually part of my job description. Secondly, when the costume has a gameplay function in the production, it's essential to be involved from the very beginning and to be able to contribute to and learn from other areas of game development. And Marvelous Designer has been, again, brilliant for design and technical iterations. So what works? Since the costume packs were proved effective in Project X, I compiled one for our Shadow Work protagonist, but in this production I can actually visualize it. So first there is the Marvelous Designer file, and then the FBX of the fitted costume with the FBX flats. So I just export the patterns for the UV layout, and then the detail board and render. What else works? It's really easy to check the technical issues and reiterate in Marvelous Designer. So I send a version to Orator and he tests it, and then I can go back to the file and fix any issues, and we'll try again. Okay, takeaways. It's not going to be one slide, it's going to be like 15. So tools for collaboration. Marvelous Designer, mirror boards, and Milanode are all amazing. Referencing methods, costume detail boards, physical costume and texture references, character photo shoots, and motion references. And what to consider when working with a costume designer. The skill set. Can they use Marvelous Designer or Photoshop? And this might sound like a joke, but a lot of costume designers don't actually know how to use Photoshop, and I didn't know how to use it when I started at Remedy, so I had to learn on the job. The size of the team. Small team has different requirements for costume work. I've presented 3 examples. So Remedy had the biggest team, 120. Project X has 40, and Shadow Work currently 5-ish. And this affects directly on the collaboration, such as who are the closest colleagues and which are the best methods for communication, and what are the team's costume needs. What is expected for costume work, concepting or manufacture both. the time frame. Do you need them for full-time, part-time? Like consider prioritizing the task if you have a smaller time with them. And what equipment do you have? Do you have Marvelous Designer or 3D Scan? These are both allowing the costume designers to contribute to the production side of the things. So those are brilliant. So I'll address the benefits of consulting costume designer by aligning all the pipelines we've gone through of each production. You don't actually need to see what it says. I'm going to go and highlight each of them. So analysis and context work. The costume designer can develop the context further and create dress code documentation to define the fashion of the world. Marvelous Designer was utilized in each production for both technical and design iteration and costume manufacture. Costume detail boards were convenient, especially with high detailed costumes. And the costume designer is handy, especially for translating the concept into a costume, either digitally or physically. And in all 3 productions, I provided additional references, feedback, and support for the stages of modeling, texturing, and rigging. And this is not actually an evolution of a pipeline. It's just showing the variations of the costume pipeline depending on the production and the size of the team. And that's my last slide. So if anyone wants to study digital costumes or needs an intern, let me know. And that's my email. Thank you.